We're talking about photosynthesis. And you know what? I don't know if I've said it before, but I should remind everyone that the word photosynthesis is kind of two words put together, right? They're photo and synthesis. Photo refers to all of the parts that need light, and the light dependent reactions are these first three that we talked about. And the second part is going to be all of the synthesis reactions, which means building the actual glucose molecules. And the synthesis reactions are particularly important to the synthesis reactions is the Calvin cycle, right? So photosynthesis is photo and synthesis. And so far, we've been talking about the light reactions. And right now, we're just talking about photosystem 2, which is the first photosystem. And there you go, right? So we're talking about how when the sun's photons hit electrons in pigment molecules, particularly chlorophyll B, chlorophyll A, and carotenoids, then it excites their electrons into a higher state. And as they fall down, they kind of bounce around the pigments of the photosystem until they get to the chlorophyll A. And then the chlorophyll A will give away those electrons into the primary electron acceptor. That is a protein that's going to take them and use them in the next part of the process. But when those electrons disappear, well, something's got to replace them. You can't just give away electrons. You got to get them from somewhere. And where does the cell get them from? The cell gets them from water. This is why plants need water. Write that down. Why do plants need water? Plants need water because water is going to donate electrons to the process. Without water around, you'll run out of electrons. When you run out of electrons, you can't do photosynthesis and the plant dies. Okay, so water. And water, when it's broken apart, it'll turn into electrons, hydrogen ions, and then oxygen. So when students look at CO2 being used by this process, and then they see that oxygen is made by this process, I can completely understand how, if I ask you, where does the oxygen come from? People are going to say CO2, but those of you who watch this video will know that when I ask you, where does the oxygen come from? It comes from water. It does not come from the CO2. I'm writing it down right now because it's going to be a quiz question, and you'll know it. All right. So we did these first three steps. These first three steps require light there at the moment. Now, these next three steps can happen in darkness, but we're not going to dwell on that. That electron that got sent to the primary electron acceptor, that protein, that primary electron acceptor is going to send that electron into these proton pumps. Remember, proton pumps were used in aerobic cellular respiration too. And it's the same kind of logic that's being used. There's energy in these electrons. Let's make it do something. What shall we make it do? We will make it pump hydrogen ions into the thylakoid. So across the membrane of the thylakoid, from the stroma, that goo stuff, down into the inside of the thylakoid. And then we have lots of hydrogen ions really crowded together. Remember this part? It's almost the same as what the mitochondria does. It's just barely twisted, just turned on its head. And then the hydrogen ions are like, oh, I am so sad because I'm all crowded. So then we have got an ATP synthase that says, I'll let you leave crowded hydrogen ions, and as they leave, they are going to make ATP, right? Now, that's not all that happens. Also, photosystem 1 is going to go ahead and make NADPH. And making NADPH to power the Calvin cycle, I'm going to just gloss right over, but your lecture instructor probably won't. So I'm sorry, but make sure you know that as well. Yeah, this is just another one of my analogies. You know, if we have a pump and the pump pumps water up here, then water just will fall on through. Or if we're a little kid and we're at the beach and we put sand in here, then sand will fall on through. And if it turns this little wheel while it falls on through, technically I can hook that up so that it makes electricity. Well, the way the cell works is instead of putting sand into the top of the toy, we've got these proton pumps putting lots of hydrogen ions here into the thylakoid space. And then it runs on through. And as it runs on through, it spins the little wheel. And instead of making electricity, it makes ATP. So the same kind of logic. Oh, look, here it's written down nice. So photosynthesis has got the photo part, the light reactions, and it's got the synthesis part that could and can in some plants be performed in the dark. The light reactions will have the splitting of water and the electron transport. Splitting of water were the first 3 steps, electron transport, the second 3 steps. Then there's also photosystem 2, right? Now, the ATP and the NADPH, those 2 energy molecules, cellular respiration, the point was to make energy molecules. The point of photosynthesis is not to make ATP. It's actually to make sugar, which will be a stored form of energy. So the light reactions make ATP and NADPH. And by the way, making of ATP was same sort of logic. You got a spent battery and you charge it up. But now this is going to power something called the Calvin cycle. Okay, the Calvin cycle. With aerobic cellular respiration, we had the citric acid cycle called the Krebs cycle. But with photosynthesis, we have the Calvin cycle. I do not know a good way to remember that. If anyone knows a good way to remember it, email it to me. Maybe you'll get an extra credit point if it's really clever. So there were 6 steps to the light reactions. They required light. They were performed in the thylakoid. Ooh, there's another question that's going to be on the quiz. Where are the light reactions? In the thylakoid. Where is the Calvin cycle? In the stroma. Anyway, the light reactions happen in the thylakoid membrane. Sorry, that got cut off. This is where water gets split. This is where oxygen gets made. Oxygen came from the water. Roger all that, right? So now we are going to talk about the Calvin cycle because the point of photosynthesis is to make glucose. So far, we haven't made any glucose, right? Here's our overall equation. This will be our final stopping point, making glucose. We've already made the oxygen. The Calvin cycle is going to use these energy molecules that were made by the light reactions and use them to take CO2 and to put them together to make a sugar molecule, right? So the Calvin cycle does not require light. It uses the energy that was made by the light-dependent reactions, but it itself does not require light, and this is going to happen in the stroma. The stroma is that goo that's between the 2 outer membranes and the thylakoids. It takes 2 rotations. Yeah, that might be important. I actually won't even hold you responsible for this much detail on your quiz. You do need to know that the Calvin cycle is going to use the carbon dioxide and it's going to make the glucose molecule. That the Calvin cycle was powered by the energy molecules that were made in the light-dependent reactions. That the Calvin cycle often is clustered as part of the light-independent reactions because technically we're not using light here. That this is where the CO2 gets used, but this is not where oxygen gets made. Okay, so the CO2 from the air will be used to build pieces of sugar, and this is how glucose is made. Now, follow me on this. All of the glucose that is made by, let's talk about a giant redwood tree. Okay, a giant redwood tree. All of that glucose actually came from the air. It came from CO2 in the air. So let's imagine you're a giant redwood tree, and when you're young, I'm going to plant you in a really big pot. And at the beginning, I'm going to put exactly 1 ton of dirt into the pot. 1 ton, okay? And then I'm going to let you grow in this ton of dirt until you are a big old redwood tree. And now you're a big old redwood tree, and if I were to weigh you, big old redwood tree, you would weigh 20 tons. And then I would weigh the dirt that you came out of, and instead of 1 ton, there's actually going to be only 80% of it left. Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, right? There was 1 ton of dirt at the start, plus a seed for a redwood tree. Now you've got a 20-ton redwood tree, and you still have most of the dirt? Yes, because the weight of the redwood tree was mostly built out of CO2, which came from the air, which is kind of like magic. I think it's kind of like magic, right? Okay, so cellular respiration goes this way, right? Starts with glucose and oxygen. That, by the way, the glucose and the oxygen were both made by photosynthesis. And it's going to turn into CO2 and water and create energy molecules. And then photosynthesis is going to take, thank you very much, CO2 and water from cellular respiration. I'm going to mix that with sunlight, and I am going to make glucose and oxygen, and we can go around and around and around and around. And this is one of the reasons why. Have you ever seen those little solid glass spheres that have got a little tiny shrimp in it and a little tiny green plant, right? And all you have to do is give it sunlight and they'll just stay alive. You never have to feed them. And you're like, how is that possible? You know? And it's because the plant makes this that lets the shrimp breathe, and the shrimp makes that lets the plant grow, back and forth. Okay. Now, how do plants usually get this carbon dioxide? The leaves of plants, you're going to learn, actually need to be relatively watertight because they need to not evaporate. So they're actually just like our skin, they don't leak. And that means they don't let carbon dioxide in and they don't let oxygen out. But technically, a plant's leaves need to be able to breathe because these little guys here, they need CO2 to go in and they're going to make oxygen, and they need to exhale the oxygen. CO2 in, oxygen out. Exactly the opposite of us, right? And how do they do it? By these little mouths. And the little mouths are called stoma. Stoma, I think, is actually Latin for mouth. And if you were to look at these cells right here, they look like this. You can see they don't have chloroplasts because these cells, they painted them green, but actually these cells are not green. The ones inside are the green ones. These cells don't have the chloroplasts, but they do have a nucleus. That's a nucleus, but it's right. Oh, oh, oh. I don't know what I did. Oh. Okay, that's the nucleus right there. And here, I'm having no luck. Here's the little tiny stoma. And the stoma is designed when it's really hot outside and really dry, then the little mouths close. And when it's dark out, then they can open again. Okay. Now, there are some plants that keep most of their stoma open most of the time. Clearly, those plants are going to end up needing a lot of water because they're going to lose water through those little mouths. Whereas a plant like some kind of a succulent, they keep their mouths closed most of the time and only open up their mouths at night. Now, there's one more video, and you might be tempted to forget the next video. But the next video is short, and it has a very important question on the quiz that you will only learn from the next video. So make sure you watch the last video.